Right, okay, if we're all right, here we go. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully I'm not going to bore you to death tonight. It's called Tongued or Dumb, and Einfuhlung in Hardy's Loving Kindness. And yes, don't worry, I will explain what Einfuhlung means. So, Hardy's spectrum of juxtapositions. Tongued or dumb and loving kindness are both phrases Hardy included in his apology to late lyrics and earlier, which was his poetry collection of 1922. So, whether the human and kindred animal races survive till the exhaustion or destruction of the globe, or whether these races perish and are succeeded by others before that conclusion comes, pain to all upon, tongued or dumb, shall be kept down to a minimum by loving kindness, operating through scientific knowledge. Thus, the two sides to Hardy, many of his readers find hard to reconcile. The animal liberationist, who also fervidly believed in scientific advancement and all that entailed. In April 1910, Hardy wrote to the Humanitarian League, congratulating them on their 20th anniversary, particularly for their work in the defense of animals. Years before this, in October 1896, Hardy responded to a letter from Maud Haddon, who was the secretary of the Humane Diet Department of the Humanitarian League. I think that's just fascinating. I want that title after my name, the Humane Diet Department. It would consist of alcohol and cheese, pretty much. Who had asked him to join the society. He stated that he did not wish to belong to any committee that was pledged to a cause. Something he also said to the Suffragette Society. He cited in his letter to Maud the infamous pig killing scene in Jude the Obscure. I'm not going to go into detail about that. I'm sure most of you who have read Hardy have read Jude the Obscure and remember the horrible pig scene, which Jude was extremely upset at and tried to put an end to said pig's life with minimum amount of pain. Hardy claimed that if it did any good at all in the cause for which you are working, it was through being obviously written as merely a faithful description of such doings by an unbiased person. Hardy also appeared as the principal witness for prosecution for cruelty to a cow in 1911 in Dorchester. Yet, as he wrote in his reply to the Duchess of Hamilton's invitation to become the vice president, no less, of the Animal Defence and Anti-Vivisection League in 1923, should be delighted if it does not commit me to absolute anti-vivisection. If Hardy was truly an animal liberationist, fighting on behalf of horses, birds, foxes, dogs, and cats everywhere, why was he also not completely against vivisection? His letter to the Duchess of Hamilton equivocates. Maybe in cases which are a very small amount of suffering, such as a human being would submit to, may lead to enlightenment on some point of great value in relieving the future suffering of both men and animals themselves, then that's okay. A small amount of suffering, that's all right. He informed her that if the society were to change its name, to the Animal Defence and Controlled Vivisection Society, or simply the Animal Defence Society, then he would happily join. Though this may seem shocking in light of Hardy's renowned humanitarianism, it is important to contextualize his reaction. Hardy provided a statement for the Vivisection Investigation League of New York in 1909. Part of it reads, and I seem to have skipped one of my slides, that's that one there, except in cases where... Now, this is the one for 1909, Vivisection Investigation League of New York. And if the practice, to the extent of merely inflicting slight discomfort now and then, be defended on grounds of good policy for animals as well as men, it is nevertheless in strictness a wrong, and stands precisely as its practice on men themselves. In other words, what man will not inflict upon himself should thus not be inflicted on animals either. As Anna West points out, Hardy very carefully curated his humanitarian image, but he was also a pragmatist. Hence the scene in Far From the Madding Crowd, when George the dog accidentally drives Gabriel Oak's whole flock of sheep over a cliff, destroying his entire livelihood in one fell swoop, and then poor George is shot as a consequence. This is counterbalanced by horrendous scenes of suffering in which one of his characters does their best to relieve the situation, notably Tess Durbeyfield, breaking the necks of the dying pheasants which have dropped from the trees after a pheasant shoot. This heartbreaking scene was inspired by one of Hardy's many notes copied from different sources. In this case, the Blandford and Wimborne Telegram, fabulous, in 1881, in which a gamekeeper on Lord Wimborne's estate recounts in gruesome detail a pheasant shoot which took place there. Using only 3 guns, one day, 700 pheasants were shot. They had been driven into a corner of the plantation, and as they took wing, Hardy writes, they were shot wholesale. The fallen were duly picked up, but the wounded remained in the trees, falling to the ground in the evening and lying in agony all night. The next day, the keepers came to collect these also, 150 of them. Hardy adds to this, can see the night scene, moon, fluttering and gasping birds as the hours go on, the place being now deserted of humankind. His sheer distress is evident, powerful enough for him to re-render this episode in fiction 10 years later. Once again, I've gone streaming past a slide. There we go. Lovely Tess, lovely pheasants, and unlovely pheasants, as it were. Hardy's Facts Notebook, collected and edited by William Greenslade, are full of snippets about treatments of animals or creatures, as Anna West, who I mentioned earlier, refers to them. From a publication called The Field in 1883, Hardy records how the following were classed as vermin. These included hawks, jays, stoats, weasels, cats, rats, magpies, etc., for which a gamekeeper received 3 shillings or 4 shillings or 6 shillings a head for killing them. From the Dorset County Chronicle, that was his favourite source for historical information. From 1826, he notes a man who owned a bull terrier frequently entered into dog fights. The dog would beat any other canine its size, which spurred the owner on to place him in a fight with a much larger and stronger dog, in inverted commas, which it beat after a severe struggle. Not content, as the poor bull terrier lay, quote, panting on the ground, the owner pounded upon it a young dog, saying his dog still had pluck for another battle. Feeble and lacerated, the poor dog yielded. The owner was so enraged, he killed it. Found in an issue of the Dorset County Chronicle of 1827. Nightingale at Lincoln. People assembled night after night to listen to the bird as it sang in an adjoining garden. Owner of garden shot it on its perch, disliking trespassers. However, Hardy didn't just record the atrocious behaviour of humans. He also noted an eccentric farmer, as quoted, who was a friend to vermin. 60 rats seen feeding at his pig troughs, and he kept up a hotbed of manure for snakes. There's an entry from 1884 regarding a cattle fair in Edinburgh, where, in quotes, a bull rushed at a woman, catching her upon his horns, bore her aloft through the excited crowd of spectators. The woman, half dead with fright, suffered only bruising after the bull had thrown her onto the grass, an obvious source for the bull who threatens the safety of Lucetta and Elizabeth Jane until it's tamed by Henchard in The Mayor of Casterbridge, which had been published 2 years earlier. Personally, I'm on the bull side. Then there is my favourite cutting from the Morning Chronicle of 1811. This time I'll try not to forget the slide. Here we go. The gibbet near Drinksey Nook, fabulous name, between Gainsborough and Lincoln, upon which Thomas Otter, alias Temporel, was hanged in chains for the murder of his wife 5 years ago, presents at this time a most extraordinary sight. Under the jawbone of the skeleton, a small bird called the featherpoke has built her nest, which extends downwards nearly as far as to the ribs. And in that situation, she has performed her incubation and hatched a nest of young ones. Nature ultimately has the last laugh over the cruelty of man, a favourite theme of the romantic capital R poets. So we come to creatures of poetry. Hardy's own poetry is, of course, powerful, provocative in its representations of creatures, be they animal, insect, or plant. An August Midnight, a general favourite amongst Hardy fans, recounts an evening meeting in Hardy's study comprising a Longlegs, a moth, and a Dumbledore. Together, which for those of you Harry Potter fans, it's actually a bee. Together with a sleepy fly that rubs its hands. He calls them his guests and writes of how they besmear his new-penned line or bang at the lamp and fall supine. He questions why they are supposedly God's humblest, when they know earth's secrets that know not I. Then we have the puzzled game birds, which again evokes that awful scene in Tess. Pheasants cannot understand why the humans who used to feed them when they were young now wish to bereave and bleed them at achieving adulthood. The last chrysanthemum is poignant for its final stanza after describing the beauty of a flower that has bloomed too late in the season to fully benefit from the weather. The narrator says, I talk as if the thing were born with sense to work its mind. Yet it is but one mask of many worn by the great face behind. Are plants sentient creatures with the ability to think? Hardy certainly thought so. He famously forbid his gardener from pruning away any of the trees at Maxgate because he believed that they could feel pain. He would perhaps have felt great concern at the fall of the tree named after him in St. Pancras, Christmas before last. Not that he ever knew of the tree, of course. It didn't exist until the 1930s. So I'm afraid the romantic story of Hardy planting a seed while moving the gravestones at St. Pancras is just that, a lovely story. But he would have felt sadness that a life had come to an end. Though thankfully in this particular case, there is hope for natural regeneration. Of course, there is the famous The Darkling Thrush. Every Hardy fan knows that poem. It features a tiny aged bird, frail, gaunt, and small, end quote, whose plumes are blast beruffled by the winter air on New Year's Eve, 1900, yet who sings with his whole soul of some blessed hope, of which the narrator is unaware. In the Roman grave mounds, a man buries a little white furred thing, stiff of limb, whose life never won from the world a thought. Yet the furred thing is all to him. The little white cat was my only friend, though it seems in the poem that the small furred life was worth no one's pen, as Hardy writes, except that of Hardy, of course. Incidentally, Hardy originally composed this poem on the death of one of his own cats, Snowdove, in 1904. Florence, by now a part of the household staff, she became his second wife for those who aren't familiar, found it insulting that a cat was considered more of a friend to Hardy than herself. Then we have Horses Abroad, which is a direct riposte to the use of horses during the Boer War. As Michael Milgate points out, he is the, to date and probably ever will be, most eminent Hardy biographer of all time. Hardy was acutely distressed at the plight of what he described in a letter to Florence Henniker in February 1900 as the mangled animals who must have terror superadded to their physical sufferings. In his poem, Hardy describes the dead horses of the war as gaunt and gassed, as being classed as war waste. But again, Hardy's poetry, like his facts notebook, does not concentrate solely on animal suffering or the bleakness of existence. One of his cleverest and funniest poems is, "Ah, are you digging on my grave?" I can see Rob smiling there. It's a fabulous poem. The grave belongs to a woman who has been wronged by her husband, a man who is now remarried. The poor soul feels the disturbance of the mound under which she is buried and wonders if it is said husband, or a family member, or even the enemy she was thrown over for. It is in fact a dog, who replies to the questionings of one who thinks she is truly cared for after death by someone after all, with, "Mistress, I dug upon your grave to bury a bone, in case I should be hungry near this spot when passing on my daily trot. I am sorry, but I quite forgot it was your resting place." As invested as Hardy was in creatures of all kinds, he was loath as a public figure to add his name to any particular cause. However, this was certainly not the case for his first wife, Emma, or for the woman who occupied a large part of Hardy's heart, though she continuously spurned his advances, Florence Henniker. Emma was never afraid to loudly voice her opinion of anyone who mistreated animals, which Hardy greatly admired. Emma held an anti-vivisection meeting at Max Gate in 1897, and she berated London cab drivers for their heartless treatment of the horses who provided their livelihoods. It said she actually got down out of a cab once and stood there and just went at a cab driver, completely humiliated him in front of everybody. Hardy stayed in the cab. In The Egyptian Pet, Emma wrote scathingly of servants and cottagers who improperly treated such a superior animal as a cat. She adored her cats. Mrs. Henniker launched a campaign on behalf of the RSPCA against the use of horses in wartime, which was spurred on by Hardy, who then wrote Horses Abroad. Which brings us to Hardy and Darwin. Hardy's literary notebooks demonstrate the proliferation of his self-imposed interdisciplinary reading program. Of course, remember, this is a man who was never given the opportunity to go to university. In fact, he left education at 16. He investigated such subjects as astronomy, cosmology, geology, evolutionary theory, antiquities, anthropology, mythology, the classics, capital C, and psychology. Leonard Bjerk writes that Hardy was an earlier claimer of Darwin, and George Levine observes that for Darwin, evolution eradicated the divide between the human and the animal. Ergo, for Hardy, humans were not, in the cosmic scheme of things, more important than bugs, horses, and birds that seem constant companions to humans, whether the humans are always aware of them or not. Anna West elaborates in detail the human-animal interaction in Hardy's novels, and how Hardy portrays the human-animal boundaries in a post-Darwinian context. Elsewhere, Levine notes that against the interpretation that Darwin's rationalization and intellectualization of the world had stripped it of meaning and value, Hardy looks with Darwinian eyes and re-enchants that world. I would tend to disagree with the contention that Darwin stripped the world of meaning and value, especially when considering his monumental 1872 publication, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This book was particularly hated by certain branches of the community. Darwin's rigorous studies of animal behavior showed unequivocally that creatures are sentient, just like humans. We read of how hares and rabbits will not use their vocal cords except in cases of extreme suffering, for they prefer to stamp loudly on the ground as a signal to their comrades. Cattle and horses will suffer great pain in silence, but when associated with terror, they utter fearful sounds, reminiscent of screaming, apparently. Darwin believes that the saying, "to have his back up," is derived from the appearance of one dog approaching another with hostile intentions, alluding to the hair on the back of the neck and the hair on the neck and back bristling. Conversely, when dogs feel affectionate, they lower their ears in order to exclude all sounds so that their whole attention may be concentrated on the caresses of their master. And they also emit behavior that resembles laughter when happy, grinning and sniffing amidst their gambols, Darwin says. Darwin notes that cats use their voices much as a means of expression, and they utter under various emotions and desires at least 6 or 7 different sounds. Gibbons, apparently, I didn't know this until I read this book, Gibbons produce an exact octave of musical sounds, just like Kate Bush, ascending and descending the scale by half tones, and thus may be said to sing. And many insects apparently stridulate, which is rubbing together specifically modified parts of their bodies, Darwin says, to express different emotions. Darwin also observes that the expressive actions of monkeys are closely analogous to those of man, citing an example of tickling a young chimpanzee under the armpits, which then chuckled and laughed at him as the sensation caused, as in the case of our children. Reading these studies can only have positively influenced Hardy's own opinions on the sentient qualities of creatures, both tongued and dumb. Levine comments that the works of both men are marked by an astonishing and wonder-inducing attentiveness to the particularities of life, from ephemera and barnacles and worms and ants and slugs to rabbits to horses to birds and grass and trees, and finally, people. It is particularly telling that people comes last in this list of nature's elements, for both Darwin and Hardy were always much more comfortable around non-human creatures. Now, this brings us to Einfuhlung, and if anybody German is in the audience, my profuse apologies at my revolting pronunciation. So, Levine writes, that few Victorian writers saw as clearly as Hardy that nature in its quite literally sublime complexity and variety has the power to evoke excitement and wonder and awe. In this perception, Hardy follows the Romantics, capital R, particularly Wordsworth in the boat stealing episode of The Prelude that I still have the pleasure of teaching to GCSE students. Nature will always be capable of a sublimity that man can never hope to aspire to. And it is what Levine states as Hardy's wanting to deliver to the reader an aesthetic assessment that lay beyond the merely rational and understanding of nature. That brings us to the notion of Hardy's involvement with the 18th century German philosophy of Einfuhlung. This was a concept based upon the notion of empathy in the relationship between man and nature. According to Magdalena Novak, the idea may have had its source in the philosophy of Johann Gottfried Herder, who thought that while perceiving different natural phenomena, one can look for similarities to the human and thus ascribe human feelings to them. For Herder, nature had a consciousness which could be penetrated by man thanks to empathy. Other philosophers to interpret Einfühlung in this way included Schelling, Novalis, and the Schlegel brothers, all of whom Hardy read in translation. Friedrich Vischer believed that nature could manifest itself as an emotional being, which was a primary natural instinct, he wrote. The most important practitioner of Einfühlung was Theodor Lipps, who claimed that during perception, the subject permeates the object with affection and strength. A bit like lovely Lorraine's son that she was speaking about before our lecture took place tonight. Lipps wrote that the viewer feels as if he was inside the object, the source of the feelings, which is why Einfühlung is commonly translated as feeling into. For Novak, empathy with nature involves human tendency to anthropomorphize and animate nature that facilitates the understanding of strange phenomena and ascribes life and feelings to the inanimate elements of nature. This is a notion closely tied to the literary technique of pathetic fallacy. Ringing bells, English teachers? Holborn, I'm looking at you. When human characteristics are ascribed to non-human elements, such as leaves dancing to the ground, or storm clouds that appear to be angry. Hardy, however, was not one to anthropomorphize. He literally felt into whatever he wrote about, utilizing the strength of his loving kindness. And now for the last slide of two of my boyfriends. This is Nathaniel Parker as Gabriel Oak and Rufus Sewell, he's my main boyfriend out of the two, as Giles Winterbourne in The Woodlanders. And I'm just going to leave that there, if that's okay, everybody. So, where are we? According to Hardy's contemporary and friend J.M. Barrie, Oak is the hero whom novelists try to draw eternally, the good fellow with head as well as a heart. A manlier Englishman was never drawn. Yea, Gabriel Oak. Barrie also states that Gabriel is the true growth of Wessex soil. Woo. I posit that Gabriel Oak is a midwife to nature through his practice of Einfuhlung. He articulates an empathy for the correlating non-human constituents of Far From the Madding Crowd, such as his sheepdog, George the Elder, not George the Younger, who was shot after running all the sheep off the cliff, thinking he'd done a really good job that day. The hayricks, the toads and spiders that alert Gabriel to changes in the weather, and the sheep, for whom he is both midwife and nurse. Oak is able to feel into nature and recognize the needs of other-minded creatures. Notice I said creatures, not just people. It is what formulates his identity. While the term nurse during the 19th century, of course after Florence Nightingale, connoted images of feminine care, Hardy has imbued Oak's character with a power that valorizes the male as nurturer. Here's one of my favorite passages from Far From the Madding Crowd. Gabriel was already among the turgid, prostrate forms. He had flung off his coat, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and taken from his pocket the instrument of salvation. It was a small tube, or trochę, with a lance passing down the inside, and Gabriel began to use it with a dexterity that would have graced a hospital surgeon. Passing his hand over the sheep's left flank and selecting the proper point, he punctured the skin and rumen with the lance as it stood in the tube. Then he suddenly withdrew the lance, retaining the tube in its place. And of course, that's how the gas escapes from the bloated sheep who have been eating clover, naughtily left out by Troy, naughty, naughty man. Tube, trochę, lance, puncturing. They're all highly suggestive of the phallus, of course, yet rather than conquering in a sexual sense, Oak is instead nursing. He's rescuing a herd of blighted sheep from certain death. Oak performs a number of duties within this novel: shepherd, shearer, itinerant farmhand, flute busker, bailiff, and finally farmer, capital F, within his own right. Each occupation performed stoically, but also with a deep sense of empathy for all that surrounds him, whether plant, animal, or human. I could provide 1,000 million examples, but I won't because people want to get to sleep at some point tonight. Since the publication of The Woodlanders, one of my favourite novels, not the favourite, which is Far From the Madding Crowd, of course, many critics have remarked upon the similarity between Oak's character and that of Giles Winterbourne, or my boyfriend Rufus Sewell. I'm just patting him there. However, where Oak is comprised of a nature combining mothering with masculine earthiness, Giles is presented as an allegory for nature and its many constituent parts. He is the embodiment of Einfuhlung itself. Terry Wright argues that Giles is like Tess in his purity. He is purely natural, his moral rectitude and oneness with nature, contrasting with the infidelity and sophistication of a more cultured rival, Edward Fitzpierce, of course. Giles is a man of the earth, one of nature's stoics, described in an unsigned review for the Saturday Review in 1887 as the very genius of the orchards. I think that's quite lovely. His work is that of the woodlands he personifies. His character represents pagan otherness, and Geoffrey Thurley avers that Giles is a Dionysiac worshipper of the earth and the seasons, associated profoundly with growth, I should say, and fruitage. A number of scenes within the narrative allude to Giles as a fruit god, or god of the woods, as he is called. He is, among other things, a cider maker. Gee, I wonder why I like him so much. Cheers, everybody. And Hardy's narrator describes him in terms of fecundity. He looked and smelt like autumn's very brother, his face being sunburnt to wheat colour, his eyes blue as cornflowers, his sleeves and leggings dyed with fruit stains, his hands clammy with the sweet juice of apples, his hat sprinkled with pips. The image of the apple is in fact contiguous with Giles's character. Andrew Radford has written of Giles's representation as a figure of fertility and his personifying the earth's thriving abundance. He ascribes to Giles the epithet of wood god and notes a quasi-mystical correspondence between the woodlander and his trees. He calls it a fertile bond fostered by his custodianship of the forest and its ancient culture. While Giles may share some traits with that of his predecessor Oak, the former can be read in the role of nature's midwife, but Giles seems to give birth to nature itself. He had a marvellous power of making trees grow. Although he would seem to shovel in the earth quite carelessly, there was a sort of sympathy between himself and the fir, oak, or beech that he was operating on, so that the roots took hold of the soil in a few days. Hardy's choice of a surgical discourse here, as signified by the words operating on, connotes a figure with power over mortality. Winterbourne's fingers were endowed with a gentle conjurer's touch in spreading the roots of each little tree, resulting in a sort of caress, under which the delicate fibres all laid themselves out in their proper directions for growth. Where 19th century society came to view empathy as a humanistic principle, valuing the experience of another human, through the figure of Giles as wood god, Hardy appears to illustrate the primary concept of empathy as espoused by Theodore Lips, that empathy involves the recognition of other minded creatures, regardless of the form they take. So Anna West reminds us that reading Hardy's creatures requires a willingness to shift one's perspective and to attend to the multiplicity of worlds and ways of being. Hardy's worlds comprise multiple microcosms populated with sentient beings both tongued and dumb. A wonderful example of his power to recreate an intimately sensory world is that provided by George Levine. When one hears the grinding of trees competing grimly against each other for space in the thick woods of Hardy's Woodlanders, it is not the idea of the struggle, but the startling implication that the trees have sensibilities and voices that is most surprising and most moving. The trees in the Woodlanders, the chrysanthemum in Hardy's poem, Darwin's stridulating insects, all have a voice as important as that of any human. West notes that Hardy looks at the world after Darwin with empathetic vision. But despite feeling continuity with the animal and vegetable worlds, she feels that he is unable to find exactly how that sense of altruism should be enacted. I would rejoin that it is enacted through the philosophy of Einfuhlung, through Hardy's innate sense of loving kindness, and his plea against man's inhumanity to man, to woman, and to the lower animals. Thank you very much.